As we wrap up this section, we come to more definitions of environmental justice. This is Aldo Leopold's definition. He actually calls it a land ethic. So, what Aldo Leopold writes in this section from what's called his book, A Sand County Almanac, is the land ethic. And Leopold argues that there is, as of yet, no ethic dealing with man's relation to land and to the animals and plants which grow upon it. The land relation is still strictly economic, entailing privileges, but not obligations. And so this is an interesting sentence, especially this second part that says the land relation is still strictly economic, entailing privileges, but not obligations. So this is the sense that the land has been given to humans to use, but we're not obligated to take care of it. It's for our use, but it is not our obligation, versus a perspective that would say we are all part of this ecosystem and we are obligated to care for it and not just receive privileges from it or try to extract or exploit what we can get from the land. And this was written in 1949. And so in 1949, Aldo Leopold was calling for a land ethic, that the same way that we have ethics towards other humans, what's expected of how we might treat another human, even to some degree how we might treat people in times of war, things like that. There's human rights violations. Not that we have that figured out, certainly not, but there are some morality around that, which at least at this point in 1949, he's saying we basically have no morality when it comes to the environment. We just do what we want. I wouldn't say a lot has changed since 1949. There are certainly environmental groups. There's much more of an environmental conscience since then. We had Rachel Carson's Silent Spring since then. But certainly there's a lot of work to do, even though this was written over 70 years ago. And so as we finish up A Terrible Thing to Waste, we get to the part about what can we do. So this is a helpful ending to any nonfiction book that outlines an issue in culture. So this one is, of course, specifically environmental racism, but we start to hear what can we do about this. So we track other instances of where civil rights and environmental conservation meet in a crosshair. And then also Washington goes as far as to give individuals different options, which is not just something to think about in terms of the content of the book. So she might give good advice, but also just if you're writing an argument or if you're writing something, should you be obligated to provide somewhat of an answer and not just outline problems, which is what Washington does. So that's quite helpful. And then finally, we have another perspective on what environmental racism looks like and a possible solution. So in this podcast, based on Ibram X. Kendi's work with anti-racism, he discusses with David Truer the land back movement. And what does that mean? So if you've heard this term before, but you've never known what exactly that means, this gives you a good sense of what activists who espouse this belief, land back belief, mean and what it means for Native Americans. So discusses the land back movement and the environmental consequences of colonizing Indigenous people. So what equilibrium did we have before Indigenous people were colonized, and that way of life that was in sync with environment and in sync with ecology was changed radically in just a couple hundred years. And so Ibram X. Kendi and David Truer discuss, well, what do we do now? Which I think is a helpful thing to be thinking about as we get to the end of the book. A lot of times the rhetoric of environmentalism can be quite tricky, and academics have to be careful at times too, because talking about things like environmental racism and climate change and all these different things can feel and realistically can be quite apocalyptic. So it's always helpful to have a part of this learning, this investigation about, well, what do we do with this information? And so Leopold, in a more theoretical way, is suggesting a perspective. Washington is suggesting both systemic and personal things people can do if they are impacted by environmental racism. And then David Schur in this is suggesting basically a policy that he believes would help address some of these issues. And so think about, what would environmental justice look like to you? What do you believe environmental justice to be? All these different writers are trying to think about that. What is environmental justice? Is it a land ethic? Is it personal or systemic changes that prevent environmental racism and the poisoning of our environment that impacts marginalized people? Is it giving land back to Native Americans that was once taken away from them? What in 2023 is environmental justice, and how can we begin articulating this concept? I'm excited to hear what you all think of this, and what more possibilities might or could be.